David, we have people watching online, so
Oh, I see.
if you
Okay,
can,
well then I will try and do it here.
yeah, maybe it makes sense for David to send
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry to cause all this chaos.
Sorry about the...
Okay, in a sense, there's 8 goals, 18 targets, 48 indicators. I'm interested in whether the Millennium Development Goals are actually being met in urban areas. And of course, you'll know eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, promote gender equality, reduce child mortality. These are things we have evidence for in urban areas. Improving maternal health, combating malaria, other diseases, safe water and sanitation. Now, if I'd been commissioned to prove to you the MDGs worked, I could give you some fantastic statistics. Less than 1% of the urban population is poor in North Africa, the Middle East, China, Central Asia, and East Europe, a World Bank statistic. Only 1 to 2% of many African nations' urban populations is poor, a statistic from a paper in World Development in 2003. 227 million people escaped from slums 2000 to 2010. And then the official WHO UNICEF statistics that most of the urban population has improved water and sanitation. The problem is that all these statistics are nonsense statistics. In the next 10 minutes I want to show you why, and I hope you will believe me. How can less than 1% of the urban population in North Africa, Middle East, China, Central Asia and East Europe be poor if 30 to 50% of their population live in informal settlements lacking water, sanitation, drainage, healthcare, schools? Why are child stunting rates so high in most of these when supposedly the urban population isn't poor? Anyone who doubts there isn't massive urban poverty in China would need to confront Dorothy Solinger in a really seminal paper on the scale and nature of urban poverty in China. She reckons maybe 20 to 30% of China's urban population suffers serious deprivation from lack of income, not the 1% claimed in the World Bank statistics. And of course, urban dwellers have more monetary needs than rural dwellers. Big city dwellers have especially high monetary needs. You have to pay rent for housing, often 20 to 30% of the income of low-income households. Yet housing costs are not factored into most poverty lines. Water and sanitation is expensive because you don't get it in a public distribution. Just to frighten you, there's a 500-fold difference in the cost of water from the mains in Cairo to a peripheral settlement in Luanda that gets water from tankers. A 500-fold difference in the price of water per unit, per gallon. Of course, health and education have to be paid for. In Kibera, the famous informal settlement in Nairobi, most of the population can't get their kids into government schools. So they send them to private schools, very poor quality, but they still add to the burden on low-income households. You can't get public health care, an additional cost that you have to meet. Transport is an especially costly thing for many low-income groups in cities because they live on the periphery. Yet none of these non-food costs are actually calculated when they set poverty lines. Interestingly enough, I suspect that some of this was a transfer from British concepts. When a poverty line was first used in the UK in the 50s and 60s, it didn't include health and education because the welfare state guaranteed access to health care and to education free. It didn't include housing costs because municipal authorities were responsible for addressing homelessness. So a methodology that was suited maybe to the UK got transferred to Africa, Asia, and to some extent Latin America uncritically. There's a series of studies that we've done that actually look at how much it costs to avoid deprivation in cities. In Pune, this very successful 3 million population city in India, officially 2% of the population are poor. Yet a very careful analysis showed that 40% live in poverty. In Cairo, officially only 5% of the population are poor, but half live in very poor quality accommodation, mostly in informal settlements. The cost of non-food needs in these informal settlements is 2 to 3 times the official poverty line in Cairo. You have to ask how and why they set such an unrealistic poverty line. In Buenos Aires, officially, a very, very small proportion of the population are below the poverty line, yet 30 to 40% live in poverty, having difficulty putting sufficient food on their tables. Indeed, even those with above $2 per person per day face serious deprivation in Buenos Aires, a reminder of how expensive it is to live in informal settlements. In Lusaka, very careful costing by a research group that have been monitoring prices of all basic foodstuffs and all non-food items for 15 years found that you need 3 times the poverty line in Lusaka to be able to afford just adequate accommodation with water and sanitation. Who gets safe water? Well, we go to the official WHO statistics, WHO UNICEF statistics, and it looks fantastic. 95 to 98% of urban dwellers in Northern Africa, Asia, Latin America have improved water. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, 83% do. But this isn't a measure of safe water. The Millennium Development Goals says we must increase the proportion of people with safe water. Improved water includes standpipes. Standpipes where 1,000 people compete every day for getting water. Standpipes where there's no water in the standpipe for more than 2 hours a day. Standpipes where the water it provides are fecally contaminated. Yet these are still included in the official statistics as improved water. If I was to show you this graph, this is the percent of the urban population with improved water. It looks very impressive. Actually, at this distance, I can't... Oh, yes. Angola, Madagascar, Nigeria, Mozambique, Rwanda, Liberia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, all with 60 to 80% of their urban population with improved water. If we change the criteria simply to water piped into the home, that's what you get. It's a completely different picture. This still isn't a measure of who's got safe water, because many people with water piped to their homes still have fecally contaminated water. My friends in Mombasa, who did a survey of water provision, found that 25% of Mombasa has water piped to their homes, but they haven't seen any water for 2 years. So even this is an inadequate measure of whether people have got safe water. And look at the contrast. If you're assessing the MDGs by who's got improved water, maybe we're going to meet the MDGs. If you're assessing who's got safe water, we certainly aren't. It's exactly the same for sanitation. Most of the population have what is called improved sanitation, but improved sanitation includes something as basic as a pit latrine with a slab. Now, we all know that in urban contexts, a pit latrine with a slab, with no possibility of emptying it, with no possibility of maintaining it, is one of the most dangerous forms of sanitation. Most urban centres in Africa have no sewers. A very high proportion of all urban centres in Asia have no sewers. Now, we can argue whether sewers are the most appropriate form of sanitation, but for high-density large cities, there ain't much else that can actually remove fecal matter on the scale with which it's generated, also with the wastewater. I think it's useful, instead of having this, do you have safe water, do you not have safe water, there's actually a series of steps you move from having no safe water to a shared standpipe, to relying on water kiosks and vendors, to pipe supply to the home, to finally what we enjoy, drinkable water 24 hours a day. You've got that same difference for sanitation. You shift from open defecation to a very poor quality pit latrine, to a slightly better pit latrine, to a pit latrine that gets regularly emptied, to a poor flush latrine, which for the first time eliminates the smell, and finally to a WC with a septic tank. Now, if we look at the risk of fecal contamination, from the top it goes very high, high, medium, medium to low, low. If we're producing safe sanitation, it means that we've got to reach the bottom of that figure. And yet the cut-off point at the moment for what is judged to be improved sanitation is where that red line goes. I must say, I celebrated when the UN published the statistics saying that 227 million people had escaped from slums between 2000 and 2010. Now, since the Millennium Development Goals is improving the lives of 100 million slum dwellers, this is fantastic. This is, at last, we're meeting the Millennium Development Goal. But when the government of India was told that 60 million Indians had moved out of slums, they wrote to the UN and said, where? Oddly enough, this apparently would reduce India's slum population from 37 to 28% of its population. The Indian government wanted to celebrate this as a success, but it didn't know where the statistics had come from. What the UN had done is they'd reclassified improved sanitation to include a latrine with a slab. Their definition of a slum then generated an automatic movement of 227 million people out of unimproved to improved sanitation, which meant they didn't live in a slum. This is a completely nonsense statistic produced by a change in the definition for the statistic. Unfortunately, 227 million people have not moved out of slums. They just adjusted the criteria for sanitation to an even more inappropriate basis for adequate sanitation. Urban malnutrition, the goal is to halve the prevalence of underweight children. Now, I tried to look at the DHS, the Demographic and Health Surveys, which have good information on underweight and underheight kids, but you really can't get the statistics. However, if you look at how bad the statistics are now, it's very, very unlikely that they're showing an improvement trend. It's common for a third of urban children to be stunted in low-income nations, over 40% in Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Madagascar. Remember that usually urban children are said to be privileged over rural children, but actually the statistics don't seem to show this. This is the percentage of urban children undernourished in states in India. Remember, this is, super successful economy, booming. The blue line is the poorest quartile, and you will see the astonishing levels of undernourishment. Uttar Pradesh, 63%. This is the urban population, poorest quartile. Maharashtra, one of the most dynamic and wealthy states, over 60%. Bihar, Delhi, the capital. 58% of urban children in the poorest quartile are undernourished. The other astonishing thing about this is look at how high the undernourishment is amongst the rest of the urban population, the red line, not the poorest quartile. This does not suggest that there is a trend towards reducing undernourishment amongst children. Infant, child and mortality rates. Very ambitious goals set up by the MDGs, quite rightly. Reduced by 2/3 under 5 mortality rates. Reduced by 3/4 maternal mortality rates. But most of the low-income nations have under 5 mortality rates in urban areas over 80. Well, that's getting close to 1 child in 10 dying before the age of 5. And that's the urban average. That's not in the informal settlements. If you go to the informal settlements, very often those rates are 2 or 3 times higher. Look at Nairobi. It's one of the few cities where a detailed analysis has been done of under 5 mortality rates. If you look at Nairobi and you compare it with rural and with other urban, the under 5 mortality rate looks pretty impressive. It's much lower than the rural average. But let's look at the average for the slums. Half the population live in informal settlements or slums in Nairobi. Look at Kibera. Look at Embakasi. Embakasi, 1 child in 4 is dying before the age of 5. And almost all the causes are easily preventable. The rich kids, the rich families in Nairobi don't have 1 in 4 of their children dying. We know how to stop this. It's just not being done. This is too detailed for me to read out and probably for you to read, but if you get the presentation, you'll see it. Surprisingly, there's evidence of an urban penalty, i.e. poor urban dwellers having worse mortality or morbidity statistics than poor rural dwellers. Now, this is very surprising because there's always been said there's urban bias, but in 3 or 4 studies, it's been demonstrated that actually being poor in an urban area is just as deadly for premature death or stunting or underweight as it is in rural areas. For interesting statistics here, the references are given at the back of the presentation. I think I'm running out of time, aren't I?
Take another 5 minutes.
Okay. I think we have to recognise that we are not doing enough to address the MDGs in urban areas. We've got to look at new ways of acting. We've got to look at new ways of defining the problem. All poverty lines need to be reconfigured so they factor in the non-food needs. Housing rent, water, sanitation, drainage, keeping kids at school, healthcare, transport, lighting. I would suggest that 40% of poverty is likely to be in urban areas in Africa, Asia, and Latin America if we had poverty lines that were accurate and were also differentiated. So, for instance, in Nairobi, the urban poverty line will be higher than small towns in Kenya, reflecting the higher cost of basic needs. Remember that aid agencies are only as effective as the intermediary they fund. Aid agencies are only as effective as the intermediaries they fund. Aid agencies have to engage with two critical actors: local governments and the grassroots organisations and federations formed by the urban poor. I want to give you very quickly one example of a new institutional framework which I think is relevant to addressing the MDGs. In 16 nations, there's now federations, national federations of slum dwellers, of shack dwellers, of homeless people. Many of them with remarkable capacity. In India, the National Slum Dwellers Federation and Mahila Milan have 2 million members. This isn't, this is a major movement rooted in women's savings groups. Thailand, 5 million people part of community savings groups that engage in slum and squatter upgrading. Big in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya. In Zimbabwe, actually the federation is still active and negotiating land from local government, keeping below the radar of national government. And then national federations in Brazil, Cambodia, Malawi, Namibia, Nepal, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Swaziland, and Uganda. All innovating around meeting their needs. All innovating in offering local government partnerships. We set up a fund in 2001, a very modest fund, £200,000 a year it started as. But this was a fund on which these grassroots organisations could draw. Funding was available from between 10,000 and 50,000. It could support any initiatives they chose: housing, water, sanitation, visiting each other, learning from each other, experimenting. What they did was to meet their needs, buy land, build houses, and show local governments what they were capable of. And so more and more local governments came to support them. When local governments work with grassroots organisations, obviously what you can achieve multiplies 5 to 10-fold. And of course these are mass movements, mainly women, almost all women-led, who seek negotiation as a priority, although they will come out on strike if threatened. And to just give you an idea, a huge range of projects funded over the last 10 years. There's a little booklet here for those of you that want lots of nice pictures and quite a short summary. Those that want the heavy academic analysis, they can email me. We don't get much demand for the heavy academic analysis. And so it funded land for housing, upgrading, bridge finance. Very often governments who commit resources to a project, it'll take 18 months to negotiate it out of the bureaucrats. So we did bridge finance so they could start immediately. Lots of water, lots of sanitation, lots of mapping, detailed enumerations of informal settlements which give local government the basis for upgrading, give them the data. These are enumerations that professionals struggle to do. Visiting each other, celebrating each other's successes. In Namibia, for instance, they convinced the city government of Windhoek to reduce plot sizes and reduce infrastructure standards. Suddenly, many of the poor could afford a legal plot rather than an illegal plot. Not quite sure what's happening. Oh, this is a wonderful settlement in Zimbabwe. There were 300 women got land. They built housing that houses 2,000 people. When I visited them, they made the mistake of announcing that I'd given them the money to buy the land, which was only $18,000. I got songs of praise, 5 offers of marriage, and they're keeping a plot for me for my retirement. Amazing community toilets, designed, built and managed by women's savings groups, illiterate women's savings groups in most instances in India. And of course, all these things have relevance because they're improving housing, they're improving tenure, they're improving water, they're improving sanitation, they're strengthening livelihoods, they're reducing hunger, they're reducing infant and child mortality rates. They're increasing individual household community capacity to cope with shocks, with stresses, with diseases. Far greater gender equity because it's the women's savings groups that underpin all these. So my final two slides. International agencies, including DFID, could have a role supporting these direct. It isn't needing very much money, but most of these federations have an urban poor fund set up that's managed professionally by accountants that gives complete transparency and accountability back to donors. But the fund is still controlled by the grassroots organisations. The Swedish government is experimenting with putting a little bit of money towards this. The Norwegian government is experimenting with a little bit of money towards this. So even the official aid agencies are doing so. So if I was to give you a very quick, animated action, this is how aid agencies, official aid agencies and development banks are structured. They're channeling money to recipient governments. They've got to cope with Parliament or with being overseen by a board of directors. They've got all sorts of commercial interests, non-commercial interests, environment interests, media interests pushing them. They push the money to recipient governments. Sorry, this is a bit slower than it should be. They push money to recipient governments who've also got this whole raft of commercial and political influences. They push money to, who push money to local governments, who push money to local contractors, who finally reach those with all the unmet needs the MDGs are trying to meet. There's no accountability between decisions about who gets funding and the people on whose needs this whole structure is legitimated. All I'm asking is that 1% of official donor assistance goes into this little green box. And this little green box is working with and entirely accountable to those with unmet needs. Indeed, it's supporting their own organisations. And of course, as it supports the federations, the organisations, so they can negotiate better with local contractors and local governments and really drive a process of change. I haven't had time to describe it, but there's 40 papers in the journal I edit, Environment and Urbanisation, with all the detail about all these federations. Many have achieved national success, several 100,000 households brought out of poverty. I think this is an important post-MDG agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Yeah, just two resonances quickly from that before I hand on to Andrew and Claire. I think the situation on data is probably in some ways worse than you present, in as much as the World Bank methodologies think they make adjustments, particularly for rent, by imputing to the rural areas. Yes. But if they're still producing those figures with those adjustments, then you have to ask some very big questions because they're clearly wrong. And the other thing I would say is I do agree, the two major aid agencies I've worked for, I think had great deal of difficulty in working out how to work in the urban space. I mean, partly because they tend to be focused on national institutions rather than the subnational municipal level. But that was a great presentation. It's opened up a lot of areas. So now I'd like to move to